Good morning, guys and gals. I hope you guys had a nice weekend. I hope that you got some rest, that you were able to relax, turn off all the technology and schooling and Google Classroom, and just focus on your family and some good downtime. I hope that you also had a great Mother's Day for those of you who are celebrating. This week, we're going to combine what we learned about polynomial functions and what we learned earlier in the year with factoring. So we're going to be learning how to factor polynomial equations. Okay, this week you have to take notes on this, and then you have to show your work. So your work should have the same steps. You don't have to write it out in words, but you do have to show the same steps, okay? First step is, because it has an equal sign, it's an equation. This is just an old school factoring quadratic. So this is a review of what we already know. You always want to get it equal to 0. So that's step 1. Since it's equal to 10 right now, I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. And then I'm going to write x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. So that's my first step. I put it in the standard form, which means highest exponent down to the lowest, or the constant at the end. Next, I'm going to set up my diamond. Okay. And we can do a times c, but a is 1 here, times c is negative 10. So that's really just negative 10. And the b goes in the bottom, 3. And you're finding the two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add up to 3. So you take a second, you figure that out, and you say, hey, wait, don't 5 times 2 multiply to 10? But one of them has to be negative. Since the 3 is positive, that means the bigger number is positive. So the 5 is positive, and the 2 is negative, because the 3 was positive. I write it in my factors, x plus 5, x minus 2, and then I put the equal 0 at the end because it's equal to 0 here. Last step is we split and solve. So where the factors touch is where we split. We write x plus 5 equals 0, x minus 2 equals 0, and then we just solve each. So I minus 5 here, x equals negative 5, and I would add 2 here, and x equals positive 2, and those would be my two roots, meaning that on a graph at negative 5 and at positive 2, the graph would go through those points, and I know it's a smile because the a is positive. So remember that these numbers, the roots that you found, always match up with the x-intercepts. Okay. Now we're going to see a new type of example. Same idea. So take notes on this. If you need to pause to write the last one down, go for it. Here we'll see how do we factor it when we have a higher exponent. So notice this has to the third power. We're still going to start the same way by getting it equal to 0. Since it's equal to 2x squared, I subtract that from both sides. And I have to make sure to write it in the right order. So when I'm looking at the order to put it in, I know the highest exponent goes first, so that's x to the third. The next highest is minus 2x squared. Then the minus 35x equals 0. So notice it goes from highest exponent down to lowest. Next, we have to check for a GCF. So this is going to be the hardest part that we do here, and totally new. GCF means something that can divide out of everything. So the first thing I want to look is, what is my a value? Well, my a is 1 here, okay? So that means that it's probably going to be, I could divide everything by 1. And then I want to see, does every term have an x in it? It does. So whatever the lowest exponent is, the lowest variable exponent, okay, that's going to be what we choose. Meaning that our GCF will be 1, because that's the a, x, because that's the lowest x value. Just x. So now we're going to divide that out of everything. So what that looks like is I start with what I already had, x to the third minus 2x squared minus 35x equals 0. And I'm going to divide every single term by 1x. Okay? And on the outside of the parentheses, I'm going to write 1x, and then I'm going to write parentheses, and then I'm going to write what I get when I divide it. So x squared divided by 1x is just I'm sorry, that was x to the third. My bad. Okay, is just x squared. 2x squared divided by 1x is minus 2x. Negative 35x divided by 1x is negative 35 equals 0. Okay. Now we're going to factor what's inside the parentheses. So I'm going to be factoring this right here, the same way I just did. So I set this up. I put the negative 35 on top and the negative 2 on bottom. And I take a second and I think to myself, what multiplies to negative 35? Well, 7 and 5 jumps out at me. And since the number it adds to is negative 2, I know the bigger number is negative. So it's negative 7, positive 5. So when I write everything now, okay, I'm going to write 1x on the outside, and then x minus 7 and x plus 5 equals 0. So here, when I split and solve, I have 3 splits going on. I have a split right here and a split right here. So I'm going to have 1x equals 0, x minus 7 equals 0, and x plus 5 equals 0. And now I'm going to solve each one. So the first one I just divide by 1, and x is equal to 0. The next one I add 7, x equals 7. And the last one I subtract 5, x equals negative 5. So feel free to go back if you need to. There you go. You can pause it right here, copy that all down, and make sure you have it. Just a quick note of what this looks like on the graph. It would look like, if you remember from last time, x equals 0 means that there would be one intercept at 0, one at 7, and one at negative 5. So our graph, and since the a is positive, goes up to the right side, would look something like that. Okay, so that's our polynomial graph with 3 roots, and that's how we factored and split and solved. Okay, now let's do 2 more examples to understand this. Make sure you take good notes on all of these, okay, and then that's it. So just 2 more examples and that's it. Same first step, we get it equal to 0. So I want to get rid of this positive 4x squared, so I minus 4x squared on both sides. I write out 2x to the third minus 4x squared minus 96x. Oh, I don't know what just happened. Oh no. 2x to the third minus 4x squared minus 96x equals 0. Great. Okay, so now it's equal to 0. It's in standard form, highest exponent down to the lowest, okay? And now I want to get my GCF. So again, I look at what is my A value for my GCF. So I'm in step 2 right now, finding my GCF. So my A is 2. And I check, can I divide each of these by 2? And I can. Then I look at what's my lowest x, and it's just x. If it was x to the third here, I would put x to the third. So that means my GCF is going to be 2x. So I'm going to divide everything by 2x, okay? I can actually just do that right here. So I'm going to divide everything by 2x instead of rewriting it all. Try to save us a little bit of time. Okay. So I put the GCF in front of the parentheses. And now I write what I get when I divide it. So 2x to the third divided by 2x. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so that's just 1. X to the third divided by x is x squared, because you're just subtracting the exponents, okay? If you think about it, x to the third divided by x means this, x to the third divided by x. 1 would cancel, leaving you with x squared, just so you understand that. Okay, next I have negative 4x squared divided by 2x, so that gives me negative 2x, or x to the first. Lastly, I have negative 96x divided by 2x, so I divide the coefficients. That gives me negative 48. And x divided by x cancels out. And I put the equals 0. Great. Now I'm going to do the same thing where I set up my x game. Okay. So in my x game, I put the negative 48 on the top and the negative 2 in the bottom. And I start dividing negative 48 by different numbers, okay? And I see that, oh, if I divide it by 6, I get 8. Or negative 8, excuse me. And since it's negative 2 it adds up to, the bigger number is negative. So the 8 is going to be negative, and the 6 is going to be positive. Because when I multiply negative 8 times 6, I get negative 48. And when I add negative 8 plus 6, I get negative 2. Now I bring down. GCF goes in front. Then I write this in factored form. X minus 8, x plus 6 equals 0. Make sure when you do the work, you're showing all of these steps. You split and solve. 2x equals 0. X minus 8 equals 0. X plus 6 equals 0. And now we just solve each one. Divide by 2 on both sides. X equals 0. Make sure you show this last step in your notes. Okay, a lot of people were skipping it and then they lost points because of that. Minus 6, and so x is equal to negative 6. These are your 3 roots, meaning that the graph crosses at 3 places on the x-axis. Okay, last example. Take a second, pause it, copy this one down. And here's our last example. Okay, in example 4, we are going to do the same first step. So the first step is always the same, get it equal to 0. So I'm going to minus 20 here on both sides. And I end up with x to the 4th minus x squared minus 20 equals 0. Now I check, can I divide, what is my a? Well, a is just 1. And do I have an x in everything? I don't. So what that means is this is just going to go straight to setting up my diamond, where they multiply to negative 20, and I have to put a number in here, so they add up to negative 1. But you may be thinking to yourself, what does this x to the 4th mean now? Okay, since I'm doing a regular diamond because there's no x over here, this is what it means. So you can make a little note for yourself that this is going to be always when you have x to the 4th in front and x squared in the middle. Okay, so that's going to be what we have there, and then we have no x here. This is when we do this method. So we find the two numbers that multiply to negative 20 and add up to negative 1. And I find it's negative 5 and positive 4. Great. Now we factor it just like we normally would. Okay, so the second step was to just set that up. Factor. Okay, and the only difference now is that when I write my factors, what goes in the front of each one has to multiply to x to the 4th power. Well, that's going to be x squared and x squared. Okay, now we write it in the minus 5 in one and the plus 4 in the other equals 0, if we have that equals 0. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to see if we're going to see if the one with subtraction is a perfect square. So only the one that has subtraction, does it have a perfect square? Well, 5, that's not a perfect square. So we would stop there for factoring. We're done with the factoring. If we have the equal sign and we want to keep going and solving, we would split and solve. So we would write x squared minus 5 equals 0 and x squared plus 4 equals 0. Then we would add 5 to both sides and we would get x squared equals 5. To cancel out squared, remember that we take the square root on both sides, just like in completing the square. And we put a plus or minus in front. So here we would have x equals plus and minus of square root of 5. Now let's do the other one. I minus 4 on both sides. X squared equals negative 4. We take the square root of both sides and we put a plus or minus. Remember that if you have a negative, inside our square root, the square root of -1 equals I because it's imaginary. Okay? So it's not a real root. So we would write it as x equals plus or minus. Can we take the square root of 4? We can. It's 2. And we write I because it's imaginary. But these are not real roots. So the only real roots we would have would be positive square root 5 and negative square root 5. So pause this, take notes on it. If it asks you for the factors, you're done at this step. So that's the factors. If it has an equal sign and it asks you to solve and find the real roots, you keep going and you find only the ones that don't have imaginary in it. So don't have a negative inside of the square root. Awesome. That's it. Actually, let's do one more example just to make sure this last one we got, because that was the hardest one, and then we'll be done. Example 5. Okay, I'll do it really quickly. So let's say we have x to the 4th power. Let's see. Okay. Minus 7x squared equals 18. So we're going to get it equal to 0. So we minus 18 on both sides. X to the 4th minus 7x squared minus 18 equals 0. We look at the front. We see, all right, my a is 1. So this is just a regular old school 1. And there's no x here. And I have x to the 4th. I have to the 4th power here, okay? So those are the things that tell us I jump right into my x factor game. Negative 18 on top, negative 7 on bottom. I say what multiplies to negative 18? Well, I realize that that's negative 9 and positive 2. So when I set it up, it's x squared minus 9 and x squared plus 2 equals 0. When I split in, I can factor more because I look over here. This one has the subtraction and it's a perfect square. So if it has x squared minus 9, that can factor to x plus 3, x minus 3, and then this one stays the same. If it just asks me for the factors, I'm done at this step. So these are the factors. So some questions will just ask for that. Some questions will ask you for the solution. So you split and solve. We write x plus 3 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, and x squared plus 2 equals 0. And now we just solve each one. Minus 3 on both sides, so x equals negative 3 is one solution. Add 3 on both sides. X equals positive 3 is one solution. Minus 2 on both sides. X squared equals negative 2. Square root both sides with the plus or minus. I get x equals plus or minus. Because I have a negative inside here, this is going to be imaginary, and I can't take the square root of 2, so it stays there. So this is not real roots because it's imaginary. These would be my only 2 real roots that I would have to enter. All right, have fun practicing Delta Math. Make sure you show all your work, and you're going to post your work to Google Classroom.